Hi, I'm Melanie Ann Phillips, co-creator of the Dramatica theory and software, and welcome to another exciting episode of Dramatica Unplugged, an ongoing series of programs that delves deeply into the secrets of story structure and storytelling to help you improve your writing with or without using the Dramatica software. Tonight's program is entitled Reception, Story Reception. What do we mean by story reception? It's the fourth stage of storytelling. The stages of storytelling are separate from the elements of story structure. Elements of story structure can be divided into four basic categories: the aspects of structure, character, theme, plot, and genre. That's what happens when you look at a story and say, what are the component pieces that make up this story? They'll fall into those four categories. When you look at the process of communication, though, however, from author to audience, it is a process, not a state of things. And so, instead of looking at categories, you're looking at stages. Stage 1 is story forming, Stage 2, story encoding, Stage 3, story weaving, Stage 4, story reception. Story forming is when you take the basic elements of a story structure and figure out how they're going to be connected to make the mechanism of your story, the underlying dramatic structure. Story encoding describes how these raw elements of structure, aspects of character like the character's problem or the goal of the story, are turned into real people, places, and events, encoded, symbolized as real things in the real world, so that the audience can look at those and connect to them as a symbolic representation of an underlying dynamic structure. Story weaving is stage 3. This is, once you've come up with the idea of how you're going to symbolize or encode your underlying structure, how are you going to unfold that information, reveal it to your audience through exposition? Will you tell them all at once what the goal is? Will you make them think the goal is one thing only to find out it's something else? Will you give them a little bit of information about the goal all the way through until they figure out what the goal actually is? All kinds of techniques exist to make the conveyance of this information interesting to the audience. The reason that you have to use these techniques is that the information can't just be plugged into their heads all at once. It first must be symbolized to be transmitted over the medium in which you're working. And then, because the medium is a time linear one, unlike a painting, for example, then you have to dole it out, parse it out in increments, weave it together. And that's what story weaving is all about. But finally, you can now come down to the stage of reception, the fourth stage. And you haven't actually done any writing yet, because all you've done is you've figured out your structure, encoded it, and figured out how you're going to weave it. You haven't written a word. Reception is where you do your writing. Now, doesn't that have a strange name for what an author is doing most? Reception sounds more like what the audience is doing. Well, in fact, the reason we call it reception is because in the fourth stage of communication, the author is turning all of this consideration about the structure, what it symbolizes, how to express it, into the actual flow of words chosen. You must consider at that point what the audience is bringing to the creation process. Because in the reception stage, it's really a collaboration between author and audience. Only if the author successfully chooses the proper words in the proper order will the audience, A, be interested enough to continue watching this story unfold, and B, will begin to understand what the unfolding of the story actually builds, and then what those symbols can be reduced to mean in terms of an underlying structure that is true for all humans everywhere. So, in reception, you have to consider perhaps there are characters that are familiar already to the audience. Perhaps you're doing an adaptation to another medium from something that was successful in its first medium. Perhaps you're working with a timely news event that you expect your audience to know about. Or you may be dealing with a specific ethnic group in your audience. Or you may be using certain buzzwords that are familiar to a particular group. Or writing just for men, or just for women, or just for children. All of these things go into the considerations appropriate to reception. Appropriate to consider these both before you write and then as you're writing.